Well, welcome to the fifth talk, which is the one on cosmology. And I'm just going to present now the slides for this talk. And this is a talk that relates to a topic that's often quite difficult to get one's head around, because at the end of the day, the universe is a very large place, and it's therefore very difficult to know if we know enough to be able to say anything of any confidence. So whatever I'm going to talk about is, in one sense, by its very nature, speculative, because we simply know too little. And then I'm going to deal with at the end, probably the most thorny issue in terms of cosmology, which is the starlight and time problem. But for the moment, let's put that to one side and consider what there might be that the universe is, in fact, a recent origin, as suggested in the Bible. For it's stated that the stars were created in one dramatic event, and that is where we get to the idea of the universe being recent origin and not an old universe. So, if we look at the first piece of evidence, which is called the missing population 3 stars. Population 3 stars are those which have no metals other than trace elements of lithium, and they would be considered the oldest of all stars in a commonly understood evolutionary framework. However, there has been no evidence of any of these type of stars being found. In fact, what we have discovered is, as far back as we go in what is considered time, that is as far away from the Earth as we can possibly go with the Hubble Space Telescope, there seems to be nothing but fully formed, mature galaxies. Another problem that we find from the long age view of the universe is we have far too many blue stars. Now, blue stars are stars that should only last a few million years. They would use up all their material so quickly. Now, the fact that they exist and exist all over the universe would suggest that this is not an old universe, but a new universe, especially as we're not really seeing much evidence of stars being formed at all. The next piece of evidence is the strength of magnetic fields in the planets. And I do remember Russell Humphreys got himself a bit of a reputation because he accurately predicted the magnetic field for Uranus and Neptune. And he did this because he was working from a creation perspective, and he saw that magnetic fields would naturally deteriorate over time. But that time would be a matter of thousands of years, not millions of years, as opposed to some vision of dynamo theory that might have been the alternative. The magnetic fields increase and reduce, increase and reduce. And he was correct when the results came in for the magnetic fields for these planets. They were, as he predicted, quite strong. And these magnetic fields suggest that the planets, including Earth, are of a recent origin. There's a lack of old comets. Comets come in and last very long. They basically burn up. They often end up going into the sun as their orbits deteriorate, or they spin off into the outer atmosphere, never to come back again. So in order to overcome this problem, there is the suggestion of what's called the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud, places where we would find comets coming in to replace the ones that are lost. But there's very little evidence that these things exist. Therefore, the existence of comets would suggest a young solar system. Likewise, the existence of spiral galaxies are a problem for an old universe. The reason being is that spiral galaxies, after 1,000 million years, would lose their spirals. They would become a very different shape. The fact that we see all over the universe, no matter how far or how close to our own galaxy, these spiral galaxies, suggests that these galaxies are not that old by the standards of 14 or 13 billion years. Then we have this one, which I find is a really interesting one, the lack of type 3 supernova remnants. This is when you have a supernova as an exploding star. Now, The type 1 supernova is something that would last for maybe up to 500 years. A type 2 would last for a few thousand years. But a type 3 is something that you would expect to have after 100,000 years. The fact that we can't seem to spot any type 3 supernovas and the number of type 2 supernovas is consistent with a recent universe would suggest that, in fact, this is data supporting a recent universe. The lack of type 3 supernovas is inconsistent with an old universe. Then we find that many of the moons around our planets display geological activity. There's been volcanic activity on Triton, one of Neptune's moons. We've even seen pictures of huge volcanic splumes coming off one of Saturn's moons, and I think it's Io. So there's a lot of evidence that the smaller planets that circle the larger planets, the smaller moons, I should say, are not geologically inactive as we would expect if they were billions of years old. In fact, they show great signs of vitality. Likewise with Saturn's rings, they are unstable. They don't seem to have been around very long, and they're changing all the time. Again, it doesn't prove that the solar system is recent, but it's certainly consistent with it. And somewhat surprising if the solar system was old. And so what I produced here is what I call a balance of probabilities. On one side, I have all those things I just described. Saturn's disks, geological activity in the planets and moons, type 3 supernova, existence of spiral galaxies, missing population-free stars, too many blue stars, strength of magnetic fields, and existence of comets. All these are consistent with a recent universe, but not really consistent with an old universe. The main thing that we have for an old universe is what we call the starlight in time problem. And that's where we say, well, look, if the starlight took 13 billion years to reach us, surely it's reasonable to assume the universe is 13 billion years old. Well, I would suggest that that is not a reasonable conclusion when we have so much other evidence pointing in the other direction. What it would suggest is that there is an issue here with starlight and time, but it won't be solved by invoking billions of years. Now, it is fair to say that there are a number of creation geologists, cosmologists, Jason Lisle, Faulkner, Russell Humphreys, John Hartnett. They all seem to have a different approach to solving this problem. And I'm not utterly convinced in any of their approaches, to be fair. And that is not to be critical of them. It is just to state that we do not have enough information, and they'll be the first to admit, to be able to come to any categorical conclusions on this. And I certainly think in the case of John Hartnett that he is changing his position anyway. Some of them have invoked time dilation from the theory of relativity. Others seem to say that the speed of light is different in both directions, so that it's almost infinite in one direction, but not so in the other. I'm more minded to think that the solution may lie in the fact that light, along with the stars, is a creational substance. That is something that has its origins in the point of creation, just as the original rocks, not the flood rocks, but the rocks that lay down the earth, would be creational. And so would be the information in the genome of all the animals. These are creational things where looking for causal connections is not going to be helpful, because they were created by miraculous events where God spoke and things came into being. It's called creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. And therefore, we may be looking at a problem that doesn't really exist. Light was created in history, and we see it now. Now, I know that position isn't entirely accepted within the circles of creation science, and I'm no doubt it has its own problems. So I'm just floating that as an idea, and I'm not saying any more about it other than that. But I do think we when we come to the issue of creation and to the worldwide flood, we must remember that we're not dealing with scientific events here. We're dealing with historical events that may have a miraculous origin rather than a causal connections that we expect in the scientific scenario. And reasonable. If God exists, then it is quite reasonable that he'll do things that don't follow purely material causation. And in the case of creation and in the case of the worldwide flood, we have two events that follow that very different trajectory. They were one-off created events from the purposes of God, but not by physical causation. And I think that should factor into our explanations of things. Well, thank you for listening to this talk. What I will want to do in my next talk is consider the academic response to all that I've just described. How have the people who are the experts responded to the information that's come about over the last 40 to 50 years in the creation science movement? So thank you indeed.